My brother Sam is dead. Chapter 8. My North Salem cousins lived in a clapboard farmhouse just off the Ridgefield Road. Their name was Platt, and there were a lot of them, 4 girls and 2 boys, and the parents, and their aunt who lived with them too. The house wasn't really big enough for them. The 4 girls slept in one room with the aunt, 3 girls in one bed, and the biggest girl and the aunt in another. The boys slept out in the barn, except during the coldest weather, when they made up pallets on the floor in front of the kitchen fireplace. When I saw how crowded they were, I realized that I was lucky not to have been raised on a farm. There was usually plenty of room in the tavern for me and Sam. We got there after dark. They gave Father and me some bread and stew, and they all crowded into the kitchen to talk. It seemed like they all wanted to talk at once. They hadn't seen Father for a year, and they wanted all the news. How Mother was, and what the war was like in Reading, and where Sam was, and all the rest of it. They were curious about me. They'd been hearing about me for 12 years, and finally they were seeing me with their own eyes. And if I'd been hearing about them all that time too, and I'd been hearing about them all that time too, and it was interesting for me to see them. I felt shy, but they didn't because it was their house. So they began asking me a lot of questions until Mr. Platt made them all be quiet so he and Father could talk. Father told them about the scary thing that had happened on the way over. Mr. Platt just nodded. He was a tall, thin man, and his clothes hung on him loosely. They call themselves patriots. They say they're only trying to keep people from selling beef to the British, but don't believe it. They'll take it and sell it to the British themselves if nobody else will buy it. They're just cattle thieves. He was angry. Lawlessness has run wild. Common decency between people has disappeared. Every man is armed against his neighbor. Well, in Reading we still have law and order, Father said. We should have it too, here too. There are plenty of loyalists in Westchester County, but there's no control. Rebel and Tory live almost in open warfare with each other. With hot food in my stomach and the open fire nearby, I was having a hard time staying awake. I knew I ought to go to bed because we had another hard day ahead of us, but I didn't want to miss the talk. I'm happy we haven't got to that point in Reading, Father said. You're fortunate. People have been tarred and feathered here. The house has been burned and livestock slaughtered. Both sides are doing it. One side burns a house and the other side retaliates. It won't be long before they're hanging people. I tell you, it's true life. Well, what about the party that escorted us here? Well, that's one of our committees of safety. They're about all we have to keep order. You were lucky. Somebody along the way saw you pass by and knew there'd be trouble. There'll be trouble all the way to the Hudson. My father shook his head. I suppose that next year I won't be able to get over here at all without an armed guard escorting me the whole way. I judge you're right, Life. My eyelids closed. I struggled to open them again, and the next thing I knew, Father was shaking me and saying, "Come on, Tim, it's time for bed." My cousin Ezekiel Platt took me out to the barn. He was only a little older than me. He was tall and skinny like his father and had red hair. We climbed up into the loft, wrapped up some hay up in blankets for pallets, and settled into bed. Ezekiel was curious about me, and he wanted to talk. Were you scared when those men came? I didn't like to admit I was scared, but I didn't want to lie either. Some, I said. You ever have that happen to you? We haven't had any trouble yet, but Father says that's just because we've kept our noses clean. We don't make an issue of being loyalists, he said. Well, are you a loyalist, I asked. Well, of course, aren't you? I guess, I said, only sometimes I'm not sure. Sam's fighting for the rebels. Did you know that? We heard that, Ezekiel said. Father got into a rage. He said that Sam was too smart a boy to be fooled by sedition. Well, he fought in the battle for New York, I said. Father says he's headstrong, but he's very daring besides being smart. Well, my father didn't think he was so smart for joining the rebels. They're likely to be hung when the war's over. Well, maybe they'll win, I said. They can't. How could they beat the whole British army? It'll serve them right for being disloyal. Well, I don't know, I said. The way Sam explains it, it sounds right to be a rebel. And when Father explains it, it sounds right to be a loyalist. Although if you want to know the truth, I don't think Father really cares. He's just against wars. We didn't really say anything for a while. If you go to be a soldier, which side would you fight on? A loyalist, I guess. But in my head, I wasn't sure about that. Suppose one day we were fighting, I suddenly saw that it was Sam I was aiming my gun at. We woke up before the sun, hitched the oxen to the wagon, herded the cattle out of the Platt's pasture where they had spent the night, and started off again on the road toward Peekskill. Peekskill? was on the Hudson River. We would turn south there and go down the river about 5 miles to Verplank's Point. From North Salem to Peekskill was more than 20 miles. It would take us all day to make 15 miles to our next stop, Father's friends south of Mohegan. We were supposed to pick up another escort. I hoped we would find it soon. I didn't like traveling through this country alone, and I kept looking around all the time for galloping horsemen. The escort picked us up at Purdy's Station. They stayed with us for about 10 miles, and then another escort took over. We spent the night with Father's friends, pasturing the cattle in one of their fields. In the morning, another escort took us to Peekskill. It was a pretty big town. Hundreds of people lived there. It was on the edge of the Hudson River, and as we rolled down the hill into the town, we could suddenly see the water. I couldn't believe it. It was the biggest river I'd ever seen. Across the other side were beautiful hills, some of them craggy and rocky, dropping straight down toward the water's edge. It was so beautiful I could hardly keep my eyes off it. "Father, it's so big," I said. He grinned. "This is nothing, Tim. Wait till we get down to Verplank's Point. The river there is 3 miles wide." The escort left us at Peekskill. We turned south, following a road that went along the river. Oh, it was exciting to me. There were all kinds of boats going up or down or moored offshore. Scattered along the river bank were docks and wharves with skiffs and rowboats tied up to them. Men and boys were fishing from the docks, and sometimes we could see people out in boats seining. It seemed like fun, a lot more fun than being a tavern keeper. "Oh, I wish we lived here, Father," I said. He shrugged. "If wishes were horses, beggars would ride." "Still," I said. "Oh, the river's pretty," he said, "but fishing's hard work. You try hauling out one of those seines up from the bottom sometime and you'll find out." "Are the people here loyalists?" "A mixture. The Dutch settled most of the land up and down the Hudson. There are a lot of them still here, and they don't much care for the English crown." We reached Verplank's Point at the end of the afternoon. It was a wedge-shaped spit of land which poked us out into the river. Father had been right. The river was gigantic here. I could just barely make out the houses on the hillside across it. They were so far away. It was like a huge lake filled with boats. They call this part of the river Haverstraw Bay, Father told me. At Verplank's Point, the land was not steep, but sloped gradually down to the river. There was a long wharf jutting out into the river with some boats tied to it. Set back on the land were pens for cattle, sheep, and hogs, and around and about were sheds and houses belonging to the men who worked the docks and shipped the livestock. Most of it went down to New York. There were thousands of British troops quartered in New York, and British sailors, too, besides the regular population of 25,000. They needed as much beef as they could get, and prices were going up all the time. Father found Mr. Bogardus, the man he usually sold his livestock to. We herded the cattle into pens and untied the poor hogs and turned them loose in the hog pens too. Then Father said, "I'll be talking business with Mr. Bogardus for a while. Have a look around, but don't stray too far." The sun was going down red and cold over the dark hills across the river. It felt good to be free of the animals. I had nothing to worry about for a while, and that was nice. Going back would be easy with only the wagon full of goods to watch over. Of course, there could always be trouble from the cowboys, but Father didn't seem too worried about it, so I put it out of my mind and wandered down to the wharf to see what was going on. The river was beginning to turn black, and the fishing boats were coming into the wharf. They tied up, and the men and boys in them handed out barrels of fish. I could see that Father had been right. They looked tired and wet and cold and dirty from the mud that came up from the bottom on the nets. One boy, about my age, got off a boat and just sat right down on the dock and stayed there, all huddled up under his coat, too tired to move. They carried the fish into one of the sheds near the wharf and began to clean them. It was amazing to me to see how fast they worked. Snap, snap, snap with the knife, and there was the fish with its head slapped off and opened up into 2 white fillets. There were a lot of pretty big fish, too. Sturgeon, they called it. Finally, I began to get cold myself and walked off the wharf and back up to the pens. It was warmer there by the animals, and after a while, Father came along. We staked the oxen out in a bit of grazing common near the pens and went into the tavern for some supper. Father was happy. He had got a good price for his cattle and had negotiated for most of the other things he wanted to bring back to Reading. It was a good wagon load, 2 hogshead of rum, a half-dozen big sacks of salt, a couple of barrels of molasses, a large chest of tea, a sack of coffee beans, a dozen brass kettles and some tin pots, a chest of breeches and some brass buckles, some drills, knives, files, axes, and spades, and small boxes of pepper, allspice, cinnamon, and white powdered sugar. We slept that night in the tavern. We ought to sleep in the wagon and save the money, Father said, but I guess it's too cold for that. The next morning, we loaded the wagon with the things Father had bought and started off. Father tied the horse to the back of the wagon and walked along beside me to help manage the oxen. It was nice having company. I was sorry to say goodbye to the Hudson River. I liked being there, and when we reached Peekskill and turned up the long hill away from it, I kept looking back over my shoulder at the water shining in the sun until we went over the brow of the hill and I couldn't see it anymore. We spent the night at Father's friends near Mohegan. In the morning, we got up at sunrise and left. The sky was cloudy and hung down over our heads like a blanket. It's going to snow pretty soon, Father said. It's cold enough, I said. I think so, he said. At night it will be anyway. I hope we beat it home. I don't want to travel 20 miles with the oxen, slipping and sliding up and down every hill. He shook his head. We've got a problem, Tim. I want to avoid the Ridgeberry area where we ran into those so-called rebels before. I thought we'd curve south a little, hit into Connecticut at Wilton Parish, and then go up through Upawag to Reading, but that'll take a half day out of our way. And with the snow coming, I'm not sure we want to risk it. I didn't feel so easy when I thought about the cowboys. Do you think they might be waiting for us? He shrugged. Well, they know we have to come back sometime. The people in Mohegan heard that a drover from Northfield had been shot on the Ridgeberry Road 2 days ago and his cattle driven off. Was he killed? Nobody knew. The report may not be reliable anyway. He shook his head. I don't know, Tim. If it snows, we ought to go the shortest way home, but I don't like going back through Ridgeberry. If it's snowing really bad, maybe the cowboys won't want to come out raiding. Well, there's that, Father said. I didn't say anything more. Neither being raided nor traveling through the snow was going to be much fun. We just pushed on. There wasn't much to do. Mostly I stayed at the head of the oxen and kept them moving. Sometimes Father walked with me, but sometimes he mounted Gray and rode on ahead a mile or so. He didn't tell me what he was doing, but I knew. He was scouting the road ahead for cowboys. It began to snow just after noon. It wasn't much at first, just a few light flakes drifting down from the sky. Damn, Father said. Oh, damn. Well, maybe it'll stop, I said. No, he said. We're in for it now. We pushed on. 10 minutes later, the sky was full of flakes falling quietly through the air. It was beginning to feel colder, and every once in a while, a quick gust of wind would slash the snow into our faces. It's going to be a bad one, Father said. Well, maybe it'll pass by, I said. I'm afraid not, Tim. He frowned. I think we'd better take a chance on going back by Ridgeberry. I don't think many men will want to ride in deep snow. By 1 o'clock, it was real hard snowfall. The wind had picked up and the snow was blowing into our faces. The oxen became white and wet, and they kept shaking their heads to throw the snow off. We walked along with our heads bent forward to keep the wind and snow from flying in our faces. I tucked my hands in my shirt for warmth. In the middle of the afternoon, we reached a fork in the road. Hold up the oxen, Father said. I prodded them to a stop. He stood by the cart staring around him. There was already 6 inches of snow on the ground, and it was blowing steadily down on us. We could turn off here for Wilton Parish, he said. Then he shook his head. There's no hope for it, Tim. We can't go on through this all night. We'll have to push on to North Salem and hole up at the Platts until it stops and then take our chances on Ridgeberry. I didn't feel very good. My hands were cold and my face was cold and my feet were getting wet through my boots and they were going to be cold too. I couldn't stop thinking about the cowboys. We'd just been lucky getting away from them the first time. They were bound to be angry with us now for escaping and they'd want to hurt us to get even. Can we get an escort through Ridgeberry, Father? I don't know, he said. We'll ask at the Platts. The walk seemed to go on and on. The oxen were balking at walking in the blowing snow. They kept trying to turn their backs to it, and it took Father walking on one side of them and me on the other to keep them going straight. They blinked and shook their big heads and bawled. It was queer how the heavy falling snow muffled the sounds of their bawling. Fighting them all the time was tiring. Several times they just stopped and lowered their heads and stood blinking in the snow. And it took us 5 minutes of beating them and cursing them to get them going again. It seemed to go on endlessly. With all that snow pouring down around us, I couldn't tell where we were. We could only see about 20 yards in any direction, far enough to tell when we might be passing a woodlot or a house if it was close to the road, but that's all. But Father always knew where we were. "Bear up, Tim," he'd say. "It's only a mile to Green's Tavern and just 3 miles from there." "Oh, can we warm up at the tavern?" "The fewer people who know we're going through, the better," he said. I ducked my head against my chest and tramped on. It began to get dark. What with the oxen balking so much, we were 2 hours behind schedule. The snow was almost a foot deep, and already the oxen were having trouble on the hills, slipping and stumbling when their hooves would strike an icy patch or a pothole hidden beneath the snow. The darkness increased until it seemed as if we were buried in it. I went on a couple of yards ahead of the oxen to feel out the road, while Father wrestled with them alone. We didn't talk anymore, except when Father cursed. Finding the road was hard. I would have to keep veering from side to side to touch the rail fences, and then make a guess about where the middle of the road was. Looking back, I could just make out the black, lumpy shapes of the oxen and the cart, with Father fighting along at their heads. Once he said, "This is Simple's Crossing. Only 2 miles, Tim." 2 miles seemed like an endless distance. But finally we saw the spot of light, then the windows shining through the snow. We pulled the oxen through the gate and drove them into the barn. They bawled with happiness. Father went into the house to tell the Platts that we were there. I unhitched the oxen, pitched them some hay, and went into the house myself. There was a great fire burning in the kitchen fireplace, and the smell of Johnny cake and hot gravy. My cousins swarmed around to help get my clothes off. I stripped right down to the skin, not caring that the girls were watching. They got me a blanket to wrap up in, and a place by the fire, and a plate of hot Johnny cakes and beans, and gravy all over it. And I began to laugh, because it felt so good to be warm and safe again. That night, my cousins and I slept by the kitchen fire.